Hello, and welcome to Around the Political World with John Ruffman. I am your host, John Ruffman. If you're a fan of the show, make sure to hit the follow button on the top right of Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening at this very moment. When you hit follow, leave a review or share an episode with a friend. It helps other people discover the show, keeps us going. As I like to point out each and every day, it expands our base. I want to talk with you this morning about what happens when one person has such an impact on America and the world. And of course, I'm referring to the President of the United States. And I have to tell you, it really doesn't matter who's president. Presidents, what they say, what they do, how they act, have a huge impact. And we know that tomorrow, Donald Trump will depart for the Economic Forum in Switzerland, with the express moment being that the United States is under attack. Now, why are we under attack? And who's attacking us? It's not our enemies who are attacking us. It is our allies. Why are our allies upset? Because Donald Trump is deciding that Greenland must be part of the United States. More than that, Donald Trump has determined that if European nations do not support this effort, he will impose tariffs. Now, I want to step back for a moment and point out that the Supreme Court is about to rule on the question of tariffs. Should a president have the right to impose tariffs? And all you have to do is take a look at the Constitution to understand that a president is not the sole authority when it comes to tariffs. Quite the contrary. It is the Congress who has that responsibility. Now, Congress has abdicated its responsibility, essentially saying to the president, go ahead and do what you want. And the answer comes clearly, loudly, only if the Supreme Court acts. So here is the imponderable. As the president now proceeds to the World Economic Summit in Switzerland, what happens when he meets our allies? And more important, what happens if, while he is there, the Supreme Court issues a judgment saying that the president does not have the power to impose tariffs? It is a fascinating question. And if the Supreme Court rules, as many believe will happen, that this is not within the president's power, what does the world then think about the power of Donald Trump? Make no mistake, the president is powerful. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. The president has the power to do many things. But now the Supreme Court will rule definitively whether or not the president has the power to impose tariffs. That's what I'm waiting for. And that may be the big question for Donald Trump. But there is a secondary question. And that is, if the Supreme Court rules that the president does not have the power, what will the president say or do? This is a fascinating period because this should not be a partisan matter. And I want to make this absolutely clear. The issue is not Donald Trump. The issue is the power of a president, any president, to impose tariffs. I've talked about the Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930, where Congress did impose tariffs. And when, in 1932, the Democrats took control of Congress, Smoot-Hawley vanished. This is a moment of decision by the United States Supreme Court and perhaps by Congress. I've said it before, but I want to say it again. The impotence of Congress is astounding. The fact that Congress is unwilling to stand up and assert its power is, to me, absolutely incredible. In the meantime, what is the fate of Greenland? Our European allies are mobilized against us. They do not want the United States to control Greenland. And by the way, what does the Nobel Peace Prize have to do with the struggle over Greenland. Donald Trump has made this so personal that it is a problem. And I want to explain to you, I've had a number of you ask me about the 25th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Let me explain to you how it works. If the vice president and a majority of the president's cabinet submit to the congressional leadership a written statement that the president is not fit, not able to resume his or her responsibilities, Congress must then vote on whether the president is fit to return to office. A vote of 2/3 of Congress, so-called supermajority, is required to prevent the president's return. In such a case, the vice president continues as acting president. Although I want to be clear, there really is no such thing as an acting president. John Tyler, when he succeeded William Henry Harrison in 1841, some people said to him, well, you're only going to be the acting president. And Harrison said, nope, I'm the president. That's it. And of course, that was it. What happens if this were to happen? And a number of people have sent me emails and asked me about the 25th Amendment. And I want to be clear. If the president were removed from office under the 25th Amendment, he could then have the opportunity to reclaim his title. But understand, the 25th Amendment wasn't designed for a political purpose. The 25th Amendment was designed to ensure that if a president had a massive stroke, were completely incapacitated, were in a coma, could not administer the affairs of the nation, then the 25th Amendment would kick in. So I want to suggest to you that the only check on the power of the president would be the power of impeachment. And we've talked about that at great length over the years. And the simple truth is, there are not the votes to impeach in the House and convict in the Senate. That would be the logical way to proceed. And are there grounds for it? And the answer, I think, is yes. Of course there is. But you need to have a majority prepared to act. Let me give you an example, another example of something that is so outrageous, so egregious, and that is the so-called Board of Peace dealing with Gaza. The president is chairman of that board by his own determination. And by the way, his term would extend there after he leaves the presidency of the United States. It's absurd. But more than that, how do you get on that board? $1 billion. That's what the president is saying. For $1 billion, you can buy a seat on the Board of Peace. Have you ever heard anything so ridiculous in your life? This is a matter of grave national security concern. And I make no bones about it. I believe it is a national security threat. But there is more. I worked for Richard Nixon, who had, as all of you will remember or studied in history, an enemies list. Donald Trump has an enemies list. We have seen that manifest in many of his actions. But what happens when a president of the United States initiates criminal charges against the governor of a sovereign state, in this case Minnesota, and the mayor of Minneapolis, because he views them as preventing the implementation of his policy? I think that is an egregious abuse of power. There are many grounds under which, in a normal time, this president would be subject to real scrutiny. But the Republicans in Congress are unwilling to do anything. And that, to me, is the greatest shame of all. I don't know what the president will say tomorrow in Switzerland. I don't know how the allies will greet him, how they will deal with him. But I do know and I do understand that there is a deep and abiding discontent about the way this president is conducting his affairs. And the personalization of, not receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, which has nothing to do with Greenland. And by the way, he got that wrong too when he said that Norway was responsible for his not receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, Norway has nothing to do with it. It is an independent group. The Nobel Peace Prize is awarded by an independent Nobel committee. Nothing to do with the government. But part of the problem with Donald Trump is don't confuse him with the facts. And when you have a president who, on top of everything else, is determined to have his way no matter what, we have a serious problem. The question of the power of the presidency, which I have talked about in previous podcasts, is to me a critical question to be raised. The personalization of the American presidency occurred when Congress stepped back. Once upon a time in our history, Congress was more powerful than the chief executive. But the redefinition of power really came, and I want to say this very carefully, in the post-World War II era. We came to rely on the president, whoever that president might be, whether it was Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Reagan, go through all of the presidents of the United States since World War II. We have relied on their steadiness, their judgment. The 25th Amendment doesn't apply to Donald Trump. He is completely in control of what he does, even if we may question his judgment. But what happens when a co-equal branch of government, the Congress, the House and the Senate, step back and simply decide we're not going to get involved? That, to me, is the fundamental question. If you believe, as I do, in the balance of power, that balance must be preserved. Yesterday, I spoke about the arrogance of power. And there also, I think, is a question about what happens when you have power and you don't use it. Let me speak particularly about the Republicans. I want all Republicans listening to the sound of my voice to understand clearly and precisely. In the end, it is true it will be Donald Trump's rise or fall, his hubris, whatever it may be. But the American people are looking at the Republican Party and they're saying, where are you? Why are you not present? And that includes the Republican leadership in the House and in the Senate. How is it possible that the leadership of the Republican Party is so quiet, so malleable, so unwilling to stand up? If our constitutional processes are going to work, there must be 3 co-equal branches of government. Now, I've spent a little time on Congress, but let me say a word about the Supreme Court. They have a lot of huge questions coming before them that will define in large measure what a president can and cannot do. There's even a case on the question of voting that's before the Supreme Court. When can absentee ballots or mail-in ballots be counted? You have a president who is determined to make sure that the voting system complies with his vision rather than the law. And the only thing that stands between democracy and, frankly, autocracy is maintaining co-equal branches of government and the Congress and the Supreme Court stepping up. The Congress we've dealt with. The Supreme Court we will discuss, because sometime in the not too distant future, maybe tomorrow, maybe a week from now, maybe a month from now, the Supreme Court will be rendering decisions which will have a huge impact on American life. It is a fascinating question. What would the founders have thought? Well, we may deal with that in the future as well. In short, there are a lot of questions, perhaps more questions than answers. But there is no doubt that Donald Trump is the center of great controversy. And whether or not he is allowed to proceed the way he is may well determine the future of the American democratic system. Thanks for tuning into another episode of Around the Political World with John Rothman. I'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. You can write a review on Apple Podcasts, drop a comment on YouTube or Spotify, and click any of the links to the show notes to connect with me on social media. Remember, please, to share this episode with a friend or colleague so we can continue to grow and expand, which, of course, is our goal. The show has been getting so much positive attention that we're excited to bring in the advertising support that you hear at the beginning and the end of this podcast. I want to also express to you my appreciation. So many of you stop me, comment, talk to me, communicate with me, and for that I'm very grateful. And of course, to Gogo Zoger, the wonderful producer of Around the Political World with John Rothman. Gogo, thanks so much. Keep up the good work. Oh, did I not note? Today is January 20th. Donald Trump is in 1 year. And can you imagine, we have 3 more years to go? I'll be back tomorrow right here on Around the Political World with John Rothman. See you then.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.